Hey everyone, Sophia here. Welcome to Revenge Shift, where the best stories come to life. Hit subscribe for your daily dose. The Brennan Industries boardroom occupied the entire 23rd floor, with windows overlooking downtown Chicago and enough mahogany furniture to deforest a small country. I'd sat in that room hundreds of times over the past 4 years, watching my brother-in-law, Marcus Brennan, hold court like a king dispensing wisdom to grateful subjects. Today was different. Today, I was presenting my findings on the company's procurement process, 4 months of analysis showing systematic inefficiencies costing the company nearly $8 million annually. I documented every redundancy, every inflated vendor contract, every suspicious pattern in our purchasing department. I should have known Marcus wouldn't let me finish. Before we continue, he interrupted, 10 minutes into my presentation. I think we need to address the elephant in the room. I paused, finger hovering over the remote. Around the table, 12 board members shifted in their seats. My sister Carolyn, Marcus's wife, wouldn't meet my eyes. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. Let's be honest, she was always just a diversity hire. This position requires real competence, not someone checking boxes for our ESG metrics. The words landed like a physical blow. 4 years. 4 years of arriving at 6 a.m. and leaving at 9 p.m. 4 years of fixing problems Marcus created and watching him take credit. 4 years of board meetings where my ideas were dismissed by Marcus, only to be implemented months later as his innovative solutions. 4 years of being called articulate, well-spoken, surprisingly capable, as if my MBA from Wharton, and 10 years of experience at Fortune 500 companies were somehow surprising given the color of my skin. The board members stared at their papers. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended me. I closed my laptop with a soft click that somehow carried in the silence. "Thank you for the clarity," I said calmly. Then I turned to the woman sitting in the corner with her ever-present notebook. "Margaret, would you join me?" Margaret Reynolds, executive secretary to 3 generations of Brennan family CEOs, looked up with shrewd gray eyes. She was 72 years old, had worked at Brennan Industries for 40 years, and had seen everything. Without a word, she stood, collected her materials, and followed me out. Behind us, I heard Marcus's uncomfortable laugh. Well, that was dramatic. Now let's discuss real solutions to our procurement issues. The door closed behind us with a final, decisive sound. Margaret and I walked in silence to my office. Once inside, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to control the shaking in my hands. "That bastard," Margaret said quietly. It was the first time I'd ever heard her curse. 4 years, I whispered. 4 years of pretending not to notice. Of telling myself it would get better if I just worked harder, proved myself more thoroughly. Margaret set her notebook down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Miss Chun, may I speak freely?" "Please." I've worked for this company since 1985. I've watched Marcus Brennan and his father before him run this company like their personal piggy bank. I've typed memos I knew were fraudulent. I've filed documents I knew were forged. I've scheduled meetings I knew were for criminal purposes. She paused. And I've kept copies of everything. My head snapped up. Everything? 40 years of memos, emails, financial records, meeting minutes, recorded conversations, and handwritten notes. All meticulously organized by date and category. She pulled a flash drive from her pocket. This is the index. The actual documents are in a storage unit I've maintained privately, updated monthly, with full backup protocols. I stared at her. Why? Because I knew that eventually someone would care enough to do something about it. Someone who couldn't be bought or threatened or dismissed. She looked at me steadily. Someone like you. My hands were shaking for a different reason now. What exactly are we talking about? Tax fraud, securities fraud, wire fraud. Money laundering through shell companies, insider trading. Falsified financial statements provided to investors and the SEC. Systematic embezzlement from employee pension funds. Margaret's voice was clinical, detached. And that's just the beginning. The Brennan family has been running a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business for 4 decades. I sat down heavily in my chair. Why didn't you go to authorities yourself? Because I'm a 72-year-old secretary with a high school diploma. Who would believe me over the Brennan family? She smiled grimly. But you're Jenna Chun, MBA from Wharton, former senior analyst at Goldman Sachs with an impeccable professional reputation. When you bring evidence, people listen. I thought about Marcus's face as he dismissed me in front of the entire board. Thought about 4 years of microaggressions and outright discrimination. Thought about every time I'd been told I was too aggressive, too direct, too ambitious, code words that were never applied to men who showed the same qualities. Show me everything, I said. We spent the weekend in Margaret's storage unit. It was a climate-controlled space in Evanston, filled with filing cabinets organized with the precision of a master archivist. It was a climate-controlled space in Evanston, filled with filing cabinets organized with the precision of a master archivist. Margaret had color-coded everything: tax documents in blue, SEC filings in green, internal memos in yellow, financial statements in red. This memo, Margaret said, pulling out a document from 1993, shows Marcus's father discussing how to hide revenue from the IRS using offshore shell companies. This email chain from 2008 details insider trading on a merger Marcus learned about through a friend on the SEC. These financial statements from last quarter were submitted to investors, but these are the real numbers, showing they inflated revenue by 40%. Document after document. Crime after crime. A systematic pattern of fraud spanning 4 decades. The procurement inefficiencies you found, Margaret said, those aren't inefficiencies. Those are kickback schemes. Marcus has been funneling company money to vendors owned by his family members and associates, then splitting the profits. You were getting close to exposing the entire operation. That's why he'd fired me. Not because I was incompetent, because I was too competent. By Sunday evening, I'd photographed and digitized the most critical documents. Thousands of pages of evidence, meticulously organized and cross-referenced. What happens to you when this comes out? I asked Margaret. She shrugged. I'm 72 and fully vested in my pension, which, ironically, they haven't been able to steal from because it's protected by federal law. I'll be fine. The question is, are you ready for this fight? I thought about Marcus's words. Diversity hire. As if my competence, my intelligence, my worth could be dismissed with 2 casual words designed to undermine everything I'd accomplished. I'm ready, I said. Monday morning, I called my attorney. David Okonkwo listened to my summary for 15 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Jenna, he said finally, what you're describing is a federal case. Multiple federal cases. This goes beyond employment law. This is criminal. I know. You'll need to contact the FBI, probably the SEC as well. This will trigger investigations that could take years. The Brennan family will fight back with every resource they have. Your life will be under a microscope. I understand. Another pause. Do you have documentation? 40 years worth. Then let's set up a meeting. I know someone at the FBI's white-collar crime division. If what you have is as substantial as you're indicating, they'll want to move quickly. FBI agent Sarah Coleman arrived at David's office 2 days later. She was 45 with sharp eyes and the demeanor of someone who'd seen every variety of corporate crime. She listened to my summary, examined a fraction of the documentation, and sat back with an expression I couldn't read. Ms. Chun, she said slowly, I've been investigating financial crimes for 20 years. What you're showing me is one of the most comprehensive documentation efforts I've ever seen. She looked at Margaret. And you compiled this over 40 years? Someone needed to keep the receipts, Margaret said dryly. Agent Coleman smiled briefly, then turned serious. If everything here checks out, and I'll need forensic accountants to verify the financial documents, we re-looking at multiple federal charges. RICO violations, securities fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. This is substantial. How long until you can move? I asked. We'll need to verify documents and build a case. But with evidence this extensive, if it all holds up, we could execute search warrants within 3 weeks. She leaned forward. I need to be clear about something. Once we move, this becomes public. Your name will be in the news. The Brennan family will know you're the source. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Marcus's face as he'd called me a diversity hire. Thought about 4 years of being told I wasn't quite good enough. Wasn't quite leadership material, was hired to check boxes rather than because I'd earned my position. I'm prepared, I said. The FBI raid happened on a Friday morning at 6 a.m. I wasn't there. Agent Coleman had been explicit that I needed to stay away from the scene. But the news broke by 8 a.m., and I watched it unfold on television from my apartment. Federal agents raided the headquarters of Brennan Industries this morning in downtown Chicago. Sources indicate the raid is connected to a multi-year investigation into financial crimes. FBI officials have confirmed multiple arrests are expected. The footage showed agents carrying boxes out of the building. Showed Marcus being escorted out in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his face pale and shocked. My phone started ringing immediately. Former colleagues wanting to know if I was safe. Reporters somehow already aware I'd left the company days before the raid. My sister Carolyn crying and incoherent. I ignored most of them. But when Agent Coleman called, I answered. "We've made 3 arrests so far," she said. Marcus Brennan, CFO Robert Chen, no relation to you I assume, and VP of Operations David Markham. We're still executing search warrants and examining documents, but preliminary analysis confirms the fraud patterns you documented. This is going to be a major case, Miss Chen. The media attention will be significant. I understand. There's something else. We found evidence that Marcus was planning to trigger an internal audit that would have implicated you in the procurement irregularities. He was building a paper trail to make you the scapegoat for his own crimes. My hands tightened on the phone. When? Within the month. If you hadn't acted when you did, you would have been facing criminal charges while he walked away clean. The diversity hire comment suddenly made even more sense. He hadn't just been dismissing me, he'd been setting me up. The trial took 9 months. Federal prosecutors laid out a case that was damning in its thoroughness. Margaret's 40 years of documentation provided a roadmap of criminal activity spanning decades. Financial experts testified about shell companies and money laundering. Former employees testified about intimidation and retaliation. The defense tried to argue that I was a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge after a wrongful termination. The prosecutor had smiled at that. The defendant called Ms. Chen a diversity hire in front of the entire board, despite her MBA from Wharton and 10 years of experience at Fortune 500 companies. He then proceeded to continue the same fraudulent activities she'd been documenting. The evidence speaks for itself. During my testimony, Marcus's attorney tried to shake me. "Isn't it true, Miss Chen, that you were angry about being terminated?" "I wasn't terminated," I said calmly. "I resigned after being subjected to racial discrimination in a professional setting. And isn't it true that you had access to all the documents you claim show criminal activity?" "I had access to some documents through my legitimate work." Margaret Reynolds, who served as executive secretary for 40 years, provided the comprehensive documentation spanning decades. I simply organized it and brought it to federal authorities. Convenient that this evidence emerged right after your resignation. The evidence existed long before my employment at Brennan Industries began. It was compiled systematically by someone who witnessed criminal activity for 40 years and waited for someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or dismissed to bring it forward. I was simply the catalyst. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Marcus Brennan, guilty on 18 counts. 15 years in federal prison. Robert Chen, guilty on 12 counts. 10 years. David Markham, guilty on 8 counts. 7 years. 4 other executives received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years. When the judge read the verdicts, Marcus looked at me across the courtroom. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame. He'd lost 20 pounds during the trial. The man who'd called me a diversity hire now looked completely broken. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction that justice had been served. Phoenix Financial Consulting launched 4 months after the arrests. I'd been planning it since the day I walked out of that boardroom, of course. The office space in River North was already leased. The business plan was already written. And I had something Marcus had never had: actual competence and a reputation built on merit rather than family connections. My first clients were 3 former Brennan Industries customers who'd reached out after the news broke, looking for someone they could actually trust. "We knew something was wrong," the CFO of a major manufacturing company told me. The numbers never quite added up. But Marcus had his family name and connections. You have a track record and integrity. That's worth more. Within 6 months, Phoenix Financial had 15 clients and $8 million in annual revenue. Within a year, we'd expanded to 12 employees and were valued at $30 million. Everything Marcus had said I couldn't do without the Brennan name. I was doing better. Margaret came out of retirement to serve as my executive assistant, though I told her from day one that executive partner would be more accurate. You built this case, I told her. You documented everything for 40 years, waiting for the right moment. This company succeeds because you made it possible. She'd smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in years. Let's build something honest, she'd said. My sister Carolyn called me exactly once after the verdict. How could you? She sobbed. You destroyed our family. Marcus is going to prison for 15 years. Our children ask why Daddy isn't coming home. How could you do this to us? I'd been silent for a long moment, processing the pain in her voice and the complete absence of accountability for what Marcus had actually done. Carolyn, I said finally, Marcus called me a diversity hire in front of the entire board. He dismissed 4 years of work because of the color of my skin. Then I discovered he'd been committing federal crimes for years and was planning to frame me for his own fraud. He destroyed himself. I just made sure he couldn't take me down with him. You could have just left. You didn't have to report him. Yes, I did. Because the next person he would have used and discarded would have been someone with fewer resources than me. Someone who couldn't fight back. Someone who would have gone to prison for his crimes. I paused. I'm sorry your children are suffering. But that's on Marcus, not me. She'd hung up without another word. I haven't spoken to her since. 3 years later, I stood in my office on the 20th floor of a building I'd chosen myself, looking out at Chicago's skyline. Phoenix Financial had grown to 45 employees. We'd expanded into 3 additional states. Our annual revenue had hit $50 million, and we just closed a deal that would double our client base over the next year. On my wall hung a framed article from the Wall Street Journal, From Discrimination to Vindication, how Jenna Chen built an empire after exposing corporate fraud. But my favorite piece wasn't the article. It was a small plaque Margaret had given me on our 1-year anniversary. The work speaks for itself. Let them try to dismiss it. My phone buzzed with a message from our newest hire, a young black woman with an MBA from Stanford who'd been told at her previous job that she was too aggressive in meetings. First day complete. Thank you for this opportunity. I smiled and typed back. You earned this position. Welcome to Phoenix. Because that's what I'd learned in the 3 years since walking out of that boardroom. The people who dismiss you, who diminish you, who try to reduce your accomplishments to checkboxes on a diversity form, they retelling you exactly who they are. And the only real victory is building something so undeniable that their dismissal becomes irrelevant. Marcus Brennan called me a diversity hire because he could unconceive of any other explanation for my competence. He couldn't imagine that I'd earned my position through merit, intelligence, and hard work because he'd never earned anything himself. Now he was serving 15 years in federal prison while I ran a company valued at $50 million. The woman who'd walked out of that boardroom had been humiliated but unbroken. The woman standing in this office was something better. She was free, successful, and surrounded by people who valued competence over connections. On my desk sat a file folder marked New Hires. Inside were resumes from talented people who'd been dismissed at other companies, told they were too ambitious, too direct, too something that really meant too competent for us to control. I was building something Marcus never could have imagined. A company based on actual merit, where people were valued for what they could do rather than who they knew or what they looked like. And every morning when I walked through our doors, I knew that nobody here was waiting for me to fail so they could say I never deserved the opportunity. That felt like the only victory that actually mattered. Margaret knocked on my door. The Forbes interview is in 20 minutes. Are you ready? I looked at the skyline one more time, then smiled. I'm ready.